Welcome to My New Life, a Lovevery podcast. I'm your host, Jessica Rolfe. As you may know, Lovevery now offers the Reading Skill Set. It's a phonics-based program that makes reading fun, motivating your child to read through play. It covers skills from pre-K all the way through second grade. In this episode, we're going to talk about the neuroscience behind dyslexia and why it has nothing to do with reversing letters. Carla Small and Dr. Nadine Gaub created Early Bird, an early literacy assessment used in school districts nationwide. Today, I'm speaking with Carla. Welcome to My New Life, Carla.
Hi, it's great to be here, Jessica. Thank you.
So, you work with Dr. Nadine Gaub from Harvard. She's a co founder and scientific advisor for Early Bird. And her position is that dyslexia is preventable. This is the first time I've heard about this, that actually you can prevent dyslexia. Can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, that's pretty eye opening, isn't it? So basically, the concept is that if you catch it early and you identify children who have a risk for dyslexia, then you give them what they need, which is basic good instruction, then you'll actually prevent the fact that downstream they won't be able to read. And that really is what we mean by preventing dyslexia. And it's a model that we see in healthcare all the time. We just don't see it in education, right? We can prevent issues in healthcare by identifying the risk early, helping the patient change their behaviors or what they're doing, and then see changes that prevent those downstream risks. In education, we can see the same thing. You identify the child early, you find out what their issues are, you give them sound instruction, and then they won't go on to be identified as having dyslexia because you've actually prevented it through good instruction.
Oh, that is so encouraging. So how early can you actually understand these differences in abilities?
We can see it with our assessment as early as 4 years of age, but actually, I think parents can often identify it even earlier than that. With my son, I noticed that he wasn't learning as his older siblings were as young as 3 years old. And that is an interesting thing. I will say it's important to understand that there's a hereditary component to this. So we have one family that we're working with. The grandfather read an article about dyslexia, realized that he had dyslexia symptoms his whole life. He called his son. His son had the same thing. Together, they pieced it together that their second grader, they now finally understood why he was having challenges in school. And so it is true that if you have dyslexia in the family, and it doesn't need to be both parents, just one parent or a close relative, then there's a 50% chance that each of your children will have it. So the first thing I would say that is a sign or a symptom is to look at your family history and say, is there anyone in the family that had a hard time learning to read? And if so, I want to pay a little more attention to how my children are doing on that. The other thing I can do is just talk about some of the typical things that we look for. So, one is a child might have difficulty with rhyming. So, if you play a game with them and you give them 3 words like cat, bat, and dog, and say, which of these two sound alike? If they have troubles with that, it's in part because they're not hearing the ending sounds of the word, so they can't identify which ones are rhyming. The other thing is sometimes they have difficulty parsing words into syllables. So you can play a clapping game, clap the syllables in cupcake. They might have trouble following directions, even if you've given them repeated instruction, things in sequence. And even if you've told them what to do in that sequence, they're not still grasping it. I'll tell you from my son, that was tying his shoes. And that boy wore slip on shoes way longer than he should have because I wasn't going to tie his shoes every day. Other things are word finding and specificity. So instead of saying, I'm looking for my backpack, they may say, I can't find that thingy. And that's often a sign of issues. And then, of course, probably the most typical is that they have trouble with letter names and letter sounds and really just associating the name of the letter with the sound that it makes.
Yeah, so that's so helpful, especially for customers who have purchased the reading skill set. If you're tuning into the rhyming, syllables, some of the word recognition, if you're noticing that there's any kind of difference between children or you're noticing that it's just taking a little longer to pick up, Carla does have a lot of resources on her website at Sprout Labs.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a fan of putting a lot of pressure on children or taking a joy away from the play. And I loved your podcast with Spencer where he was talking about how much fun you can have working with your children. And I also think it's great that in the Love Every literacy kits, there are many things that you could be using, like first sound matching And I think a parent, as a parent or as a caregiver, you're just going to know. There's going to be an indication to you that they're not grasping it quite as well as you would have liked or would have hoped. And in that case, I would just say trust your gut. I think a parent's intuition is pretty strong in this case.
So now let's talk about what to do. So I've heard that explicit instruction and just more of it, for example, what's in the reading skill set, what's on Sprout Labs website, that those things can really support your child. And if you start early and give a lot of that explicit phonics based instruction, that can really make a difference. Is that true?
Absolutely. The most important thing you can do is just give that good instruction. It should be based on Orton Gillingham practices. It should be structured literacy. And to be honest, that's good for every child. There's no harm in that. It's a great thing to be able to do with your children, and it's fun and it's developmentally appropriate. And the more you can do that when they're young, the better off those children are because they're learning those foundational skills. So people ask, like, when does somebody learn how to read? And parents might say, oh, it's, in kindergarten when the teacher starts teaching them, or it's in pre-K when they're learning the alphabet. But in fact, learning to read starts in utero because that's where a child starts hearing those oral language things like, that's my parent's voice. This is the cadence of our language. And so the first 3 to 4 years of language and reading development is actually language skills. So it's really important to be working on those phonological and phonemic awareness skills while they're young. And there are, as you say, so many exciting things in the literacy kits that enable you to do that.
So, what else can parents of 2, 3, 4 year olds do to prevent eventually getting a diagnosis for dyslexia if they have it in the family?
The best thing you can do is a lot of the activities that are in the literacy kits, basic phonological skills, basic phonemic awareness skills, teaching them letter sound correspondence, but first starting with sounds, like helping them blend words, helping them with rhyming. All of those activities are really important. I think then the issue is if and when you do suspect something is going on, I think that's when I would encourage people to take action. And the most important thing is to start in on probably a little bit more intensive instruction because this child will fare incredibly well. This is the exciting news that today we know from the science of reading that every child, virtually every child, will learn how to read, that we're actually able to rewire the brain for reading success. So if you're noticing a child isn't meeting their milestones, it's not a scary or bad thing. It's just good to know early on. This is something we want to work on a little extra. And then at a certain point, if you're noticing repeated issues, you may want to have your child assessed. And you can do that in order to better understand both their weaknesses and their strengths. And that's important. You can do an assessment, ideally through the school. So you're working in partnership with the school. You can get a neuropsych on your own. Or in Sprout Labs, we have an assessment that will tell you what your child's strengths and weaknesses are.
What does the Sprout Labs assessment look like? What is that experience?
The Sprout Labs assessment, especially in pre-K, we assess the skills that are appropriate for language development at that age. So, for example, we look at skills like wordplay and rhyming, vocabulary, letter sounds, letter names. And it seems really basic, but it's important to look at two things. One, how are they doing versus their peers? And then two, really importantly, what are the discrepancies across skills? So, if a child's strong in oral language, like they recognize what sentence means, they have a strong vocabulary, but if they can't rhyme or decode words, then we're going to pay attention because it's not typical to be strong in one area and very below in another.
That actually really resonates. One of my children had a learning assessment done, and we saw strength, and then the discrepancy was really where you can find so much information about how your children learn. So, you've also shared that when you have a child who's struggling with reading, there's a lot of emphasis on what they can't do, but it's really important to also understand what they can do. Can you tell me more about that proactive, positive approach?
I don't think there's anything more important than helping these children really appreciate their strengths because a lot of times we unfortunately spend time focusing on their weaknesses if we're working on an area. So, in the case of my son, for example, he was really strong in science, and we made sure to get magazines from the library that were focused on science, go to the science museum. We chose camps for him that were very targeted to his areas of interest. And it's just really important to reinforce that strength of self esteem, like strong self esteem, confidence, And we feel that for our child, we want them to feel it as well. So parents often share with me, they may have a child who's struggling with reading, but they're exceptional at athletics or they're really good at math. And it's just important to reinforce, to balance with the reinforcement of those strengths.
Absolutely. And then we can also talk about how common dyslexia diagnoses are once they hit school. Can you tell me a little bit more? I've heard 20%. Is that real?
Yeah. So as high as 20% of the population exhibits symptoms of dyslexia. And this is important to understand because you're not alone. There are a lot of children out there who have these symptoms. And as I said, the research shows that it's something that very much can be addressed with good instruction and we can rewire that brain. But absolutely, you see 1 in 5 typically in a classroom, 1 in 5 will be having difficulties with reading. One more thing just on the context on dyslexia. So it's commonly known that dyslexia is about a challenge with reading, but I think it's helpful to understand that what's behind that or what's driving that is that people with dyslexia have a hard time identifying the speech sounds within a word or learning how letters represent those sounds. So sometimes I think it's just hard to understand like what is a person with dyslexia seeing? And the other thing I'll say is it is not doesn't have anything to do with the visual systems, right? So very typically I think the most common question I get is, "Oh, dyslexia, they're reversing their letters," right? Well, reversing letters, flipping letters, words dancing on the line, that is nothing to do with dyslexia. In fact, children with dyslexia will sometimes reverse their letters, but so will a very typical pre-kindergartner or kindergartner on their journey, on their way to learning how to read. So it's not something to look at and panic and say, "Oh my gosh, my child has dyslexia because they wrote their B like a P." It's simply just a part of the learning journey.
I mean, reading is hard. And when you think about evolution, humans have only been reading and writing for about 5,000 years, which sounds like a long time, but that's actually too short for our brains to evolve from an evolutionary perspective. So, reading originally likely depended on some other brain circuitry that originally evolved for some other purpose. So, it's really so interesting to think about this structured way that we communicate and the way that we share information being a relatively recent adaptation. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit more context about that.
Yeah, if you talk in front of a child, they're gonna learn how to talk, but you have to teach instruction. And for some children, more than half of them, it comes pretty easily, it comes pretty naturally. But for others, they just need more what we would say dosing, right? They just need more repetition. They need more what we call explicit instruction. So they're actually being taught things like how to blend sounds together to create a word. And that's just a function of how the brain is wired. There are, critical areas in the left hemisphere that work together to enable a child to read. And it includes things like oral language and recognizing letters and mapping sounds to letters. But for a child who has dyslexia, their brain is wired differently than the typical brain. And that's why we want that instruction to be really based on sort of where their strengths and weaknesses are, and then highly structured so they're getting what they need in a very specific way with a lot of multimodal, which is again great with the literacy kits. They're getting to do things with their hands and with their eyes and really internalize different ways of learning that same thing. And with that instruction, we can then rewire the brain.
Well, it sounds like we can all end up in the same place as functional readers, being able to get through and understand our own individual strengths. But some of us need more specific, direct instruction. Phonics is the way to go. How can you tell if your school is using phonics for direct instruction to support your child's reading journey? Can you tell me more about this debate between phonics and other methods of teaching to read and how important it is to actually use phonics to help children, especially with dyslexia?
Certainly, phonics is important. And I would say that predecessor skills like phonological awareness, so understanding that those sort of step back skills that sounds come together to make words and sentences, and then also layering on the phonics, which says, okay, if you understand that that beginning of that word log was an L and it made an L sound. That's great. Now, it's also important that you understand that the L is made with this symbol. So, all of that is part of the learning that a child needs early on. And I think it's just important to see if the school is working with curriculum that's sanctioned science of reading curriculum. That's important. And then other things that you can do at home to supplement it as well.
From our point of view, that there's nothing more delightful than spending time with your child when they're engaged in playing a game or learning. They just crave that one-on-one with you. And there's no replacement for that one-on-one between a parent and a child. And so that's why we developed the reading skill set to really support that bonding, but also help to enhance learning. It's also very efficient learning. So
Mhm.
all of that, oxytocin, that positivity that's building in the brain really creates a beautiful pathway for learning. And it's also, you're getting a lot of instruction packed into a short amount of time. So school, oftentimes it's distributed because, there's quite a few kids in the room. It's hard to get that individualized instruction. So that's why we think that the reading skill set is particularly supportive for all learners. And we also want our listeners to know about Sprout Labs. There's additional support, there's assessments, there is daily activities that can be done. So we really appreciate, Carla, all the work that you're doing to enhance literacy in this country and support families.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think in my case, like you, Jessica, I have three children, and Matthew is my youngest. And I could see early on that he wasn't learning like his older siblings. And he was very talented when it came to science. Like he could watch a science show and then explain the Big Bang Theory to us. But then when it came to the alphabet or learning his letter sounds and letter names, he just wasn't getting anywhere. And then when he went to school, it was really hard for him and his self-esteem was affected. And we just watched that and it was crushing. And so that's when, in our case, we got him a neuropsych, he got good instruction, back on track. But that's really what led us to start Sprout Labs, because we just feel like those resources should be available to everyone. And so it's really everything you need to get your child reading, even if they have challenges with reading. So we have a literacy specialist who helps you navigate. We have the assessment that tells you their strengths and weaknesses. And then there's also the digital tutoring to help them get that regular practice and necessary instruction. So that's our mission now, is really get this out to everyone we can, because nobody should have to do what I did and what so many other moms do. Because from the time he was 3 to the time he was 8, before we really had a plan, I was just guessing, you know, what was going on? Did he need a tutor? What kind of tutor? And that's just no longer necessary.
Thank you for all of that important, impactful work. It's been wonderful having you here with us today, Carla. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
To learn more about Carla's work, check out Sprout Labs at sproutlabs.com. Combine Lovevery's reading skill set and the tools offered by Sprout Labs to build reading skills early. Visit lovevery.com to learn more. You've been listening to My New Life. If you think this episode might be helpful to a fellow parent, please share. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on the show, head over to lovevery.com. That's lovevery.com. Be sure to sign up for our weekly child development emails. I'm Jessica Rolfe. Thanks for listening.